He had everything: wealth, status, solitude. But what happens when the man who trusts no one decides to test the only person who's never asked for anything? In a vast Vermont estate, hidden behind acres of snow and silence, lived Graham Whitmore, a man wounded by betrayal, haunted by loss, and convinced that loyalty is always just a transaction waiting to expire. And then there was Claire, his quiet assistant of 7 years. She never asked for more, never demanded trust, never broke the rules. But was her silence a sign of loyalty or strategy? Why did she stay when everyone else left? What did she see in the man behind the fortune? And what happens when the test turns into something far more human than either of them expected? This is a story about broken people who never stopped hoping to be seen, about trust that blooms not with grand gestures, but in handwritten letters, cracked windows, and mugs of tea left for two. If this opening touched you even a little, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Let's begin the story. Billionaire tested his loyal assistant with a drunken act. Her truth was exposed. He had everything money could buy: land, power, and peace. But in the silence of his Vermont estate, Graham Whitmore couldn't quiet the one thing that haunted him, the question of who, if anyone, truly cared for him, not his name, not his fortune, but him. The wind that afternoon had a kind of patience to it. It didn't rush through the trees or slam itself against the windows like it often did in early February. Instead, it whispered. It whispered through the barren branches and across the fields, skimming the tops of fences, slipping under barn doors, and finally finding its way to the edge of the house, a place so still that even the sound of life felt like an interruption. The Whitmore estate sat on 90 acres of rolling land, most of it unused. Once, there had been plans for expansion, a vineyard, an equestrian facility, maybe even guest cottages for investors. Now, the land mostly breathed in silence, covered in snow, undisturbed. Graham Whitmore, former real estate magnate, sat in the parlor of his sprawling home, cradling a mug of lukewarm coffee in his hands, his fingers wrapped around the ceramic like it was a lifeline. He hadn't taken a sip in over 20 minutes. The fire in the hearth crackled politely, throwing flickers of amber across the hardwood floor. It was the only movement in the room, save for the subtle rise and fall of Graham's chest as he stared out the window at nothing in particular. He wasn't waiting for anyone. He hadn't waited for anyone in years. The leather chair beneath him creaked slightly as he shifted. Everything in the room was curated, hand-picked from auctions and catalogs by designers he no longer spoke to. The rug under his boots had come from a small village in Turkey. The books behind him were first editions, some never read. The oil paintings above the fireplace had names and signatures, but none that meant anything to him. Graham had built this home with the same intent he'd built his empire, with precision, distance, and steel-lined resolve. He didn't want warmth. He wanted protection. He didn't need comfort. He needed control. He used to be everywhere: headlines, interviews, keynote speeches, a rising star, they called him. The man who turned forgotten properties into gold mines. He shook hands with politicians and walked red carpets with a wife who looked perfect beside him until she left, without so much as a fight, only a note and a signed divorce agreement waiting on his desk. And before her, there had been others, business partners, friends, even family, people who smiled at him while calculating what they could gain. Everyone, eventually, showed their price. Now, he surrounded himself with silence and routine. He rose at 6. Coffee, black, 2 eggs, no toast. A walk around the barn if the weather allowed. Emails at 9, bookkeeping at 10, lunch alone at noon, and by 5, the light would shift, pulling long shadows across the floor of his otherwise spotless home. He had no dog, no visitors, no unannounced deliveries. He preferred it that way. Almost. His eyes drifted toward the mantel. Above it hung a simple black and white photo of a woman with short, windswept hair and eyes that used to know how to laugh. His ex-wife, Abigail. He hadn't moved the frame since she left, but he hadn't taken it down either. There were days he didn't look at it, Today wasn't one of those days. Graham leaned forward, setting the mug on the edge of the hearth. The fire's warmth brushed his skin, but he barely noticed. His gaze lingered on the photo as a thought circled in his mind, heavy and unshakable. People stay until they find a better deal. The words weren't bitter, not anymore, just familiar. He had said them once to his lawyer during the divorce settlement. The man had nodded like it was a business mantra, not a wound. Graham reached for the old French clock on the mantel, but his hand paused halfway. Something else caught his eye. Tucked to the side, barely visible behind a silver candlestick, was a vintage pocket watch. Not his. It belonged to his mother. He hadn't touched it in years. The glass had once been cracked. He remembered thinking he should get it fixed, but the thought had faded with the seasons. And yet, here it was, whole again. He narrowed his eyes. The repair was subtle, delicate. It hadn't been sent to a shop. Claire. Of course. She must have found it and fixed it herself quietly, like she did everything else. No note, no mention, no invoice. Graham turned the watch over in his palm. It ticked softly. The sound was strangely comforting. He hadn't thanked her. He hadn't even noticed until now. Somewhere in the house, a floorboard shifted. A draft curled through a crack near the window. The sun was beginning to fall, casting a golden wash over the parlor. The scent of cedar and coffee mixed with something faintly floral lavender, a touch he couldn't place. He returned the watch to its spot and leaned back into his chair. The fire had dimmed to embers. Tomorrow, he thought. As he closed his eyes for a moment too long, he would ask her something, not about schedules or paperwork, something real. But tonight, he stayed quiet. And as he sat there, listening to the faint echo of ticking, he realized it wasn't silence that kept him company. It was suspicion. And across the room, near the edge of the mantel, the antique watch ticked on, gentle, patient, like it was waiting for someone to finally hear it. Claire had served beside him for 7 years. She had held his schedule, his secrets, and sometimes even his silence, but never once, his trust. It had begun in New York, during the unraveling. Graham's empire was still standing then, but the scaffolding had started to tremble. Deals had soured, partnerships cracked, rumors thickened like smoke in boardrooms. And in the middle of it all, hired not by him, but by a now-fired HR executive, stood Claire Delaney. He barely remembered their first meeting. She had walked in quietly, file folder in hand, eyes calm, words few. There had been no charm offensive, no over-rehearsed pitch to impress him, just someone who listened, observed, and did the work with a kind of clean efficiency he couldn't ignore. She stayed through the worst of it, not because she was asked to, not because there was a retention bonus, but because she never gave the impression that she might leave. When Graham left New York for Vermont, Claire followed not with assumption, but with permission. "I'll understand if you'd rather start fresh," she'd said. He hadn't answered, just handed her the keys to the guest cottage on the edge of the property and said, "It's a long drive from town." And that was that. Since then, her presence had threaded through his days like linen through old seams, subtle, functional, unshowy. She never intruded, never overstepped, but somehow, everything ran better when she was near. The books balanced, the barn lights worked, the tractor was serviced before it ever broke. Birthdays were remembered not his, of course, but of the staff, the veterinarian, the mailman. Taxes were filed early. Winter boots were already by the door before the first snowfall. And tea. She made tea the way other people prayed, quiet, focused, reverent. Every afternoon around 4, without asking, she'd set a small pot on the warmer in the side kitchen. Chamomile if the day had been loud. Earl Grey if the air had gone too still. Peppermint on the days Graham didn't speak at all. She never said which kind he preferred, but she always knew. There were small things she did that had no job description. She wiped down the brass doorknobs with lemon oil, left out extra gloves in the foyer for the landscaper, set out food for the barn cat no one claimed, replaced cracked light bulbs before he noticed they'd gone dim. There was a time he tried to give her a raise. She had thanked him, accepted it, but requested it be applied retroactively to the company's charitable fund instead. When he asked why, she simply said, "There's already enough in my life." That was Claire. Enough, not less. Not more, just enough. Her past was a closed folder, but one day, early on, she'd offered a glimpse. Her mother had battled cancer for 5 years. Claire had left law school to care for her. There had been no going back. By the time her mother passed, her younger sister, May, had been diagnosed with a degenerative condition. So Claire stayed. Vermont was close enough for visits. The job, quiet enough to allow them. She never said she had sacrificed anything, but Graham knew what it meant to bury potential in the soil of duty. He knew how loss etched itself into choice. Still, she never complained, never asked for more flexible hours, never took a sick day. She showed up like the frost early, reliable, without announcement. Their conversations, if one could call them that, were mostly transactional, calendar updates, bill clarifications, travel arrangements, a brief comment about weather or the roads. But even in those brief exchanges, there was something unspoken, an understanding that sometimes the most faithful companions are the ones who never demand to be seen. And yet, she saw everything. She noticed when the cuff of his shirt had a loose thread and left a needle and black silk thread on the console. She noticed when his gait stiffened in winter and ordered a heat wrap for his knee. She noticed when he hadn't touched his dinner and swapped out the usual plate for his mother's chili recipe where she'd learned it. He never asked. She also noticed when the weight in his shoulders was grief, not posture. One Thursday afternoon, Graham returned from the barn to find the kitchen perfectly tidy. As always, a thin steam curled from the teapot on the warmer. A folded napkin sat beside it, with a note in her unmistakable handwriting. Just one sentence. The world breaks everyone. And afterward, some are strong at the broken places, Ernest Hemingway. He read it twice, then a third time. He didn't touch the tea, not yet. Instead, he picked up the note, its paper thick, the ink pressed with a fountain pen. He didn't know she used one. It felt old-fashioned, intentional, like someone who believed that even quiet messages deserved weight. He stood there for a long moment, the late sun pushing gold through the window panes, landing on the note like a spotlight. He could have tossed it, or left it there, untouched. But instead, with care he rarely showed for anything these days, he opened the drawer nearest to him, the one with old birthday cards and receipts, and placed the note gently inside. He closed the drawer slowly. Some things weren't meant to be displayed. Some were meant to be kept. And somewhere down the hall, the faint click of a door signaled Claire had already gone for the day, leaving nothing behind but a pot of tea, a folded napkin, and a sentence that now lived in the quiet places Graham had spent years trying to forget. Graham had never been a man of games. His world had always been built on clarity, structure, clean lines, contracts drawn, expectations laid bare. But that morning, as he hung up the phone with his lawyer, something cold and familiar began to stir in his chest. Russell Gentry was out. The news had come quietly, just a line in an otherwise routine update from the firm that still managed some of Graham's dormant holdings. Parole granted, time served. The name settled like rust on old metal, silent, but corrosive. It had been 10 years since Russell, a man Graham once called brother, had sold company secrets in exchange for quick cash and a quiet exit. The betrayal hadn't just cost money. It had cost the last thread of belief Graham had in friendship, in shared ambition, in loyalty that wasn't bought or bound. And now he was free, back in the world, back in reach. All morning, Graham walked the grounds of the estate, hands shoved into the pockets of his waxed cotton jacket, boots sinking into the soft gyve of early spring soil. He said hello to none of the staff. He nodded silently at the farrier tending to one of the mares. He skipped lunch. He barely noticed the whip of wind that caught the corner of his collar. His mind circled only one name, and from that name, another question bloomed like dark ink through water. How would Claire handle something like that? She had never asked for more, never lingered in rooms she wasn't invited into, never looked twice at his safe or his personal papers. She managed the estate's finances, but never touched his private accounts. She arranged his appointments, booked travel, even remembered to restock the bourbon he rarely drank. But never once had she reached beyond her lane, or had she simply been waiting. Had the silence, the loyalty, the careful space been part of a longer game? Graham hated himself for thinking it, but the thought refused to leave. He stopped walking, staring at the old birch tree just past the east pasture, its bark pale and peeling like paper skin. He used to sit beneath that tree with Abigail, years ago, long before the weight of everything had pressed into their marriage. She had trusted him, once, and then, eventually, she had left quietly, respectfully, with a lawyer and a list. Love had turned to paperwork, promises to percentages. She hadn't stolen from him. She'd just chosen something else when the stakes got high. And now, with Claire. It wasn't about romance. It wasn't even about affection. It was about proximity, about time, about knowing the angles a person might take if handed an opportunity wrapped in vulnerability. It was about control. He didn't like losing it, especially not again. By the time Graham returned to the house, the light had shifted. Afternoon had started to lean toward dusk, and the warmth from the hearth barely touched the corners of the living room. He stepped out of his boots, walked upstairs, and changed into an older sweater, soft, slightly frayed at the cuffs, the one Claire had once quietly mended without mentioning it. He moved methodically. He pulled a decanter of aged scotch from the cabinet rarely touched, kept more for display than indulgence, and poured 2 inches into a heavy crystal glass. He took a cautious sip, not because he wanted it, but because the moment demanded authenticity. He returned to his desk and opened the bottom drawer. Inside, nestled beneath outdated ledgers and correspondence, was a letter he had never meant to send, a draft of a will revision, hand-scribbled in his own neat cursive, long before he ever knew Claire would stay this long. The paper had yellowed slightly, the ink had faded, but it would do. He placed the letter face up on the oak desk, right in the center, conspicuous, vulnerable, like bait. The words on it hinted at a potential transfer of property, not binding, not notarized, but suggestive enough to raise questions in anyone who might see it. He left the safe door slightly ajar, just enough to suggest forgetfulness. Then his eyes drifted to the sideboard. There, in the soft wash of light from the window, stood a heavy crystal tumbler, one of the only surviving pieces from his wedding registry. Abigail had chosen it for its weight, its clarity, its refusal to be overlooked. He hadn't used it in years. He picked it up, rolled the cool rim against his palm. This, too, would become part of the scene. He was building a stage 1 of careful imbalance, of subtle invitations to misstep. It wasn't that he wanted to catch Claire in wrongdoing. It was that he needed proof that someone in his orbit, just one, could resist the pull of opportunity when no one was watching. It was a test, yes, but not of her, of the world, of what remained good in it, and maybe of what still existed in himself. He dialed her number just after 5. She answered on the second ring. "I might need some help wrapping up a few things tonight," he said, voice neutral. There was a pause, then her steady reply. "I'll be there in 20 minutes. He hung up. The test had begun, but as he sat back in the leather chair, watching the amber liquid catch the light, a flicker of doubt passed through him, not about Claire, but about the part of himself that needed this test at all. And just before the grandfather clock struck 6, Graham heard the crunch of tires on gravel. She was right on time. The glass sat half full on the coffee table. Graham didn't drink whiskey. Not anymore. Not since Abigail left. But tonight, he needed every part of the illusion to be perfect, the scent of aged oak in the air, the glint of amber under lamplight, the subtle chaos that hinted at a man unraveling. The study had never looked so lived in. He had spent the last hour carefully undoing its usual precision. Papers lay scattered across the desk, some even fluttering to the floor with deliberate disregard. A drawer left cracked open. His wallet, unzipped and slightly ajar, rested beside a folder marked Private. The safe's heavy door stood wide, and though nothing valuable sat in plain sight, its openness suggested carelessness. Or worse. He had tilted one of the armchairs just slightly askew, removed the lid from the scotch bottle, even left his watch normally on his wrist, face down on the windowsill. Everything whispered, something is wrong here. And now, all he could do was wait. The wind tapped gently against the window panes, as if nature, too, was curious about how the evening would unfold. Outside, dusk settled like a soft bruise over the Vermont hills, casting long shadows across the pasture. The house was silent, but for the steady tick of the grandfather clock and the occasional creak of old wood adjusting to the cool night air. Then, headlights. He heard the gravel shift beneath Claire's tires. Punctual, as always. Graham exhaled slowly. His body stiffened, preparing for the performance. The whiskey remained untouched, but he picked it up and let the rim press to his lower lip just as footsteps approached the front door. Claire entered without knocking. She always did when summoned after hours. She stepped inside with the familiarity of someone who knew not to speak loudly, not to disturb the stillness of a house that had learned to carry grief in its bones. She wore her long gray coat and a deep plum scarf wrapped neatly around her neck. Her boots, dusted with the beginnings of frost, tracked faintly against the floor. In her hands, a small white box and a folded wool throw. "Evening, Mr. Whitmore," she said gently, setting both items down on the console near the entrance before slipping off her coat. He didn't answer at first. From the study, he tilted his head back just enough so that she could see him, glass in hand, posture slumped, firelight casting uneasy shadows across his face. "You ever wonder," he began, his voice roughened by practiced disarray, "if everyone you've trusted is just—" Playing a part, Claire stepped slowly toward the study, pausing at the threshold. "I don't know who to trust anymore. Claire," Graham continued, "maybe not even you." The silence that followed was sharp, but not cold. Claire didn't flinch. She didn't defend herself. She didn't rush to fill the space with protest or platitudes. Instead, she walked in, her eyes scanning the room quietly. Her gaze passed over the open safe, the wallet, the crumpled documents on the desk. She didn't linger. She didn't ask. She knelt, picked up a scattered paper from the floor, and placed it back on the desk. Then another and another. Each movement unhurried, methodical, familiar. She approached where he sat and gently draped the folded throw across his shoulders. "You shouldn't say things like that," she said, her voice soft but steady, "when your heart doesn't mean them." Graham didn't respond. He couldn't, not yet. His grip tightened around the glass, not because he was angry or unsure, but because something in her tone, a clarity that cut through the performance, made him feel like the one being seen, not the other way around. Claire didn't press. She simply moved to the fireplace, crouched slightly, and placed a single candle, small, white, and unscented on the mantel. He recognized it. It had been a gift from one of the housekeepers last Christmas, something she'd left in a care package. He'd dismissed it at the time, calling it unnecessary sentiment. Claire had tucked it away in the linen closet, saying nothing. Now, she lit it. The flame flickered, throwing a soft halo against the stone. It was such a small thing, so quietly human. Claire turned, preparing to leave. "I left some cranberry scones in the kitchen," she said, not looking at him directly. "They're still warm." He watched her step out of the study, her boots brushing softly across the hardwood. The door didn't close behind her. She left it ajar, like always. And then, silence returned. Graham sat there, still wrapped in the throw, the glass now resting untouched on the table. The fire crackled quietly beside him, casting light on the letter he'd meant to bait her with. But all he could look at was the candle. Its flame, though small, was steady, unshaken, and it brought him no answers, only questions that ran deeper than suspicion. He stayed there for a long time, long after the fire dimmed, long after the candle's wax began to pool, listening, waiting, and wondering, what kind of person lights a candle for someone who tries to test them? Graham had expected hesitation, maybe a pause, maybe a glance too long at the open safe. Maybe even the subtle quickening of breath as Claire's eyes caught the edge of the envelope he had deliberately left visible thick, sealed, just tempting enough to warrant curiosity. But her hands never trembled, not when she stepped back into the study to tidy what remained, not when she straightened the corners of the paper he had misaligned with surgical care, not even when she passed the wallet on the table left unzipped, a few crisp bills partially exposed. She simply moved, not rushed, not guarded, just present, purposeful, quiet, the kind of quiet that couldn't be faked. Graham, still in his armchair, watched her from the corner of his eye. The blanket still lay over his shoulders, the whiskey untouched beside him. The air smelled faintly of cedar wood from the candle she'd lit, and something else, softer, warmer, like vanilla and memory. Claire knelt near the fireplace again, adjusting the candle's base with the edge of a folded tissue. Her fingers were steady, familiar, trained by years of routines and small acts of grace that went unnoticed but never unoffered. "I had a customer once," she said suddenly, without looking at him. "Back when I worked the morning shift at Carmine's Cafe in Brattleboro. He came in every day, always ordered the same thing, black coffee, cinnamon muffin, never said thank you." Graham blinked, caught off guard. Claire rarely volunteered stories. "One day," she continued, her voice even, "he left a $100 bill on the table. I thought it was a mistake. I chased him out onto the sidewalk to return it. He looked at me like he'd been waiting." She finally turned to meet Graham's eyes. Her expression was unreadable, but kind. He said, "I just wanted to see what kind of person you were." Then he took the money back, a pause, then a small smile. Never came in again. Graham studied her. The firelight cast shadows beneath her cheekbones, softening her features, making her look not younger, but more open. Like someone who had grown through storms without losing the shape of who she was. He cleared his throat, unsure why her story unsettled him more than expected. "Doesn't it bother you?" he asked. "Being tested like that?" Claire tilted her head slightly. "It did? At the time, I was 25, barely holding things together. That $100 would have meant 2 extra days of meds for my mother." She looked down at her hands. "But later, I realized some people can't believe in loyalty unless they break it first, just to see if it was ever real." The words hung in the air like dust caught in lamplight. Graham shifted in his seat. He didn't want to ask, but he did. "And me," he said, voice quieter. "Do you think I'm one of those people?" Claire didn't answer right away. She moved to the coffee table, gently straightened the coaster under his glass, though he hadn't noticed it was askew, and then finally sat in the chair across from him. Her eyes met his. "I think you've been hurt in ways most people can't imagine," she said softly. "I think trust feels dangerous to you, maybe even impossible." She folded her hands in her lap. "But I don't need you to trust me for me to do what's right." He stared at her, trying to find some sign, anything that this was a performance, that she was saying what she thought he wanted to hear. But there was nothing rehearsed about her face, her calm, her presence. It wasn't a tactic. It was just who she was. "You're not going to ask about the money," he said at last, gesturing vaguely toward the safe, the envelope. Claire's gaze flicked toward the desk, then back to him. "It's not mine," she said. "It never was." And then, as if that settled it, she rose to her feet. "That's all I need to know." She didn't say it with defiance. There was no pride or performance in her voice, just a simple conviction that did not require explanation or permission. Claire walked to the entryway and slipped on her coat, the scarf, now loosely wrapped around her neck, brushed her cheek as she tucked her hair behind one ear. Her movements were unhurried, still wrapped in that quiet grace Graham had long mistaken for detachment. "I'll see you in the morning," she said, her hand resting briefly on the doorframe, and then she was gone. The door clicked gently behind her, followed by the crunch of gravel beneath her boots. Graham didn't move right away. Instead, he sat there, the fire burning low, the envelope untouched, the safe still wide open, and for the first time in a very long while, he felt small, not weak, not afraid, just exposed. He rose, eventually, and wandered into the kitchen. He didn't know why, but he pulled open the long-forgotten drawer beside the stove, the one where random things went to disappear. Old receipts, rubber bands, paper clips, a single rusted key, and a note, folded twice, faded from time and oil. He recognized the handwriting instantly. It was Claire's, from 3 years ago, a day when his dog Jackson had gone missing for hours during a thunderstorm. Claire had found him trembling under the back deck, wrapped him in a blanket, and stayed beside him until Graham returned. The note had read, "Everyone runs when they're afraid, but that doesn't mean they're trying to leave. Sometimes they just need someone to wait for them to come back." He stared at it now, heart pounding in a way he couldn't explain. She had waited, even then, and tonight. Once again her hands had never trembled. As he turned off the kitchen light, the small candle in the study was still burning its flicker steady, casting gentle light against the shadows Graham had never dared to face. The house was quieter than usual that night. Not the kind of silence that followed sleep, but the kind that came after a shift in the air after something unsaid had finally passed between two people, even if only one of them had noticed it. Graham stood at the edge of the kitchen counter, arms folded, staring down at the cold plate he had left untouched since Claire had gone. The roast chicken had cooled to a dull gray. The carrots had wilted in their buttery glaze. And the potatoes, normally his favorite, looked as tired as he felt. He wasn't hungry, not really, but he needed something to do. Something that didn't involve staring into candlelight and wondering how many moments in his life he had ruined before they even had a chance to bloom. The oven. He turned toward it, reached for the handle. He didn't remember putting anything inside, but habit sometimes made him warm plates before dinner. Maybe he'd left one there. The hinges creaked softly as the door opened. Inside, there was no plate, no leftovers, just something thin, pale, folded neatly resting on the center rack like it had been waiting. Graham froze. He reached in, slowly, careful not to smudge the faint handwriting on the outside. The paper was warm, slightly curled at the edges, folded in half, with no name, but the script, it was unmistakable. Claire's. He unfolded it with a kind of reverence he didn't quite understand, like touching something sacred or fragile. One sentence. Sometimes, people pretend to be drunk just to see who stays sober for them. He stood there for a long while, longer than he realized. The light above the stove hummed gently, casting a soft yellow glow over the counter, the cold food, the quiet proof that nothing had gone as planned and everything had gone just as it should. Claire had known, all along. She'd seen through the glass of the performance, through the slurred words and scattered papers. Not just seen it, but understood it. And still, she hadn't exposed him. She hadn't made him feel small for trying. She'd stayed steady, kind, herself. Graham's first instinct was shame. Not the hot, angry kind, but the low, curling kind that made a man wish he had asked more questions sooner, trusted sooner, softened sooner. He had laid out his little traps like a man trying to catch ghosts, and she had walked through them like someone who knew the walls were made of air. And then, something else happened. He smiled. It wasn't much, just the quiet curl of a lip, no teeth, no sound, no mockery, just a smile. A small exhale of gratitude for being seen, not in the way the world usually saw him, but truly seen. And for the first time in years. That didn't feel threatening. It felt like mercy. He read the sentence again, letting each word settle in, pretend to be drunk, see who stays sober. She hadn't called him out, hadn't mocked the test, She'd simply left this note where only he would find it later, in private, when he had time to hear what it really said. She knew, and still, she chose kindness. Graham set the paper down on the counter, ran a hand through his hair, and turned toward the hallway. The study still glowed faintly from the fireplace. He could hear the gentle crackle from here, but he didn't go there. Instead, he walked to the drawer where he kept notepads and pens, the kind Claire always used to leave shopping lists, reminders, and receipts he never read. He pulled one out, tore a clean sheet. He stared at it for a moment, then, carefully, in the same deliberate handwriting he'd once used for boardroom memos and acquisition letters, he wrote, "You stayed sober. I just didn't know how to ask you to stay." He folded it once, then twice, tucked it into the edge of the counter by the fruit bowl where Claire always paused to jot down what the pantry lacked or what the dog needed. He wasn't sure she would see it. He wasn't sure he wanted her to see it, but he needed to write it. Sometimes, that was the closest a man like him could get to an apology, or a beginning. He poured himself a glass of water, sipped it slowly. The house didn't feel quite so cold now. Not empty, exactly, but resting, waiting, maybe like that folded note in the oven had waited, not for proof, just for the right moment to be received. As he turned off the kitchen light, the amber glow from the study flickered once more. But this time, it didn't feel like loneliness. It felt like possibility, somewhere between the silence and the warmth. Graham Whitmore realized he didn't need the test to know the truth. He just needed the courage to believe it, before the empire, before the betrayal, before the sound of gavels and closing doors. There was a boy who built a treehouse in his mother's garden. Graham hadn't thought of him in years, not since life had become layers of polished hardwood, conference calls, divorce paperwork, and distrust masked in good suits. But that morning, as snow dusted the windowsills and Claire handed him a steaming mug of tea, something small and long-buried stirred. They had been walking the paddock trail after feeding the horses, an easy ritual that, over time, had softened into something close to peace. The sun, still low, spilled warm light across the snow, casting long shadows that looked more like memories than trees. Claire had mentioned her sister, May, and how she wanted to build a little free library outside their house, just a small wooden box on a pole, filled with books and an open invitation to the neighborhood kids. Graham didn't know why that stuck. Maybe it was the way Claire described the way May had planned to paint sunflowers on the side, or the way she smiled when she said, she wants to fill it with stories people don't expect to find. And just like that, the image came back. Him no older than 10, hammer in hand, nails scattered like crumbs in the grass, as his mother stood beside a tall oak tree behind their old farmhouse in Connecticut. She had brought home leftover lumber from her friend's renovation project. "Let's give you a place to think," she'd said. "Even dream, if you want." Together, they'd built it over 2 weekends, not much more than a platform and 4 uneven walls. The door never closed properly, and the window was just a square he'd cut too low. But to him, it was a fortress, a ship, a planet all his own. He'd kept a flashlight up there, a pocket knife, a book about constellations, and once an unopened letter he'd written to himself, "In case I forget who I am." He hadn't been allowed to keep it. When his mother passed 3 years later, the treehouse became a place of silence. His father hated sentiment, hated weakness. "Tear it down," he'd said. "It's rotting." And so, it went disassembled piece by piece, dumped in a pile of broken wood and boyhood dreams. He hadn't cried. He hadn't looked back. Until now. Claire passed him the tea, both of them leaning against the fence post, snow crunching beneath their boots. "You've been quiet," she said. Graham blinked, as if waking from somewhere far off. Just remembering. Claire didn't press. She never did. But after a pause, he spoke. "There was a treehouse," he said slowly. "When I was a kid, my mom helped me build it. She said every boy needs a space to dream." He stared out toward the woods behind the pasture. The line of bare maples and sleeping oaks stood like silent sentinels, their limbs heavy with snow. "She sounds like someone who saw you," Claire said. "She did." His voice caught slightly. "But I don't think I ever let anyone else after that." Claire took a sip of her tea, then said, "You still can." He didn't answer. They walked back toward the barn in silence, letting the cold nip at their cheeks and the scent of hay mix with winter air. Inside the kitchen, she placed the kettle back on the stove, then turned toward him. "You know," she said gently, "we don't lose the parts of us that once believed. They just get quiet. They wait." He looked at her. She wasn't speaking like someone offering comfort. She was speaking like someone who had lived it. "That little boy still lives in you?" "Graham," she added, her tone neither soft nor stern, just real. "He's just waiting for you to invite him back home." The words landed somewhere deep, where logic couldn't argue and ego couldn't defend. It was the first time in years he didn't feel the need to correct someone, or prove he was already fine. Later, after Claire had gone and the house had settled back into its quiet rhythm, Graham stood at the back porch, wrapped in his wool coat. The sky had turned lavender with the fading sun. A hush lay over the land. He gazed out toward the edge of the woods, where one tall oak still stood. Not the same tree from his childhood, but similar in shape, broad, with strong, low branches that reached out like arms. He could almost see it again. The rough boards, the crooked window, the light that once spilled through the cracks in the walls like a promise. Maybe it wasn't too late. Maybe some things could be rebuilt not to relive the past, but to remember it kindly. And as the last light dipped behind the hill, Graham found himself whispering something he hadn't dared believe in a long time. Maybe it's time to dream again. She knew more than he had ever said, not because he told her, but because she listened closer than anyone ever had, not to his words, which were rare and measured, but to his absences, his pauses, the way he stirred his tea counterclockwise when he was unsettled, or how his voice dropped by half an octave when something touched too close to memory. Claire never asked for more than what was offered, and somehow that had become its own form of presence. That morning, the snow had melted just enough to reveal the muddy edge of the stone path leading from the porch to the barn. The wind had softened. The sun hung a little higher. Graham had woken earlier than usual, not from restlessness, but from something quieter. He wanted to try something. He stood in the kitchen, barefoot, still in his robe, staring at the coffee machine he never used. It had been Claire's suggestion months ago. Just in case you ever feel like surprising someone. He'd dismissed it at the time, but she'd bought it anyway, left it in the corner, quietly waiting. He read the instructions like they were a foreign language, measured out the beans, not really knowing which roast she preferred, so he guessed, poured water into the tank, placed the filter, pressed the button, and waited. The scent came first, earthy, warm, inviting. She arrived just after 7, wrapped in her usual layers, cheeks pink from the chill. She brought with her the crisp scent of frost and something faintly citrus like the soap she always used. "You're early," Graham said, voice still thick with morning. "I had a feeling the horses would want an extra flake of hay," she replied with a soft smile. He gestured to the counter. "Coffee's fresh." Claire blinked. It was the first time in 7 years he'd ever offered. "Made it myself?" he added, as if confessing to a small, brave sin. She stepped forward, took the mug he offered, and wrapped her hands around it. "Thank you," she said, and that was all. They sat across from each other at the breakfast table. No emails, no meetings, just 2 mugs, 2 chairs, and the quiet hum of the day beginning. He wasn't sure what to say, and for once, it didn't matter. The silence settled like a soft blanket between them. No weight, no edge, just presence. After a while, Claire spoke, her voice calm and steady. "My father was a quiet man," she said, staring into her cup. "He never filled a room with his voice. Some people thought he was cold." She looked up at Graham, her eyes clear. But he wasn't. He just believed people didn't need someone to fill the silence. They needed someone to honor it. The words hit something in Graham somewhere old and tender. He'd spent so many years surrounded by noise deals, demands, expectations. He'd begun to think silence was a sign of failure, a crack in the facade. But sitting here, now, with a woman who had seen more of him than anyone in decades, the quiet felt like grace. He reached across the table, slowly, cautiously, and touched her hand. Just briefly, not as a question, not even as a thank you, just acknowledgement. Claire didn't pull away. Later that afternoon, after she'd gone to tend the stables, Graham returned to his study. The candle she had lit 2 nights ago was still burning low, its wax forming soft rivers down the side. He sat at his desk, opened the drawer, and pulled out a clean sheet of paper. It had been over a decade since he'd written a letter by hand, but today, it felt necessary. He didn't know what he wanted to say, only that something inside him had shifted, something like a door he hadn't realized was locked until she sat across from him and didn't try to force it open. He began simply, "Dear Claire," and then paused. The pen hovered above the page, like a breath not yet released. He thought about the treehouse, the note in the oven, the way she smoothed the corner of his desk blotter without comment, the way she knew when to speak and, more importantly, when not to. He thought about how healing wasn't always loud. Sometimes it came in the form of warm coffee and eyes that didn't flinch. Eventually, he wrote, "There are people who walk into your life and ask to be seen. You never did, and somehow, that made me want to see you even more." He stopped there, folded the letter once, slipped it into an envelope. He didn't address it, didn't plan to give it to her, not yet. But writing it was enough for now. As dusk settled, he lit the fireplace and placed the envelope inside his desk drawer, right beside the note she had left in the oven. 2 pieces of paper, one read in secret, one never meant to be sent. Both of them said the same thing, "I see you." And that night, for the first time in years, Graham didn't fall asleep with the television on. He let the quiet stay, and in its arms, he found rest. Trust had once cost him everything, not just money, not just a name built over years of precision and guarded choices, but the deeper things, the ones that left bruises under the skin, confidence, safety, the belief that good people stayed good when no one was looking. So, when his lawyer mentioned Claire's name just in passing, it reopened every scar Graham thought had finally begun to fade. The meeting was routine, quarterly, conducted in the old stone office in Montpellier, with its leather chairs and faint scent of wood polish. James Whitaker had handled Graham's affairs for over 15 years, through corporate rises and personal storms. A man of caution, of clauses and contingencies. "Still got that assistant of yours?" James asked, somewhere between discussions of tax deferments and trust revisions. Graham didn't look up from the folder in his lap. "Yes. She's been with you, 7 years? Almost 8. James leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "That's a long time. Unusual in your world." Graham said nothing. "Ever think," the lawyer continued, casually, "that maybe she's playing the long game?" There was no malice in his voice, just calculation. The kind born from decades of watching fortunes shift because someone, somewhere, wasn't paying attention. Graham closed the folder, and for a moment, just one jagged breath of a moment, he felt the old tremor return, that sharp, gut-deep reflex that warned him, "Don't be naive. Not again." He left the meeting early, offering no explanation. Drove back to the estate in silence, the snow muffling the sound of the tires, of his thoughts, of his trust. The house greeted him with its usual hush, but this time, it didn't soothe, it accused. In the study, the fire had gone out. The chair still held the shape of last night's warmth, and on the desk, tucked beneath his paperweight, lay the letter he'd written Claire, still sealed, still unsent. He stared at it, then slowly, without ceremony, tore it in 2. The rip was clean, final. No anger in the motion, just defense, habit, He dropped the pieces into the waste bin, then walked to the window, his reflection faint in the glass. A ghost of the man he was still trying not to be. The snow had deepened since morning. He pulled on his coat, stepped into the boots by the door, and walked out without direction. The wind wasn't sharp, just steady like it had somewhere to be. Graham followed the curve of the back path, past the paddocks and down toward the edge of the woods, where the old oak stood, patient and unmoved. He remembered the last time he'd trusted someone fully. It was 7 years ago. A man named Spencer Dwyer, friend since college, business partner, best man at his wedding. They had been building something in expansion, a merger, the kind of deal that turned men into legends. And Graham, exhausted from travel and headlines, had handed over the final paperwork without reading the fine print. It took 3 weeks to unravel, another 6 months for the lawsuits, and 3 years for Spencer's conviction. But the deeper sentence was Graham's own, the vow that no one would ever get that close again, that no one would hold the pen or the access or the part of him that still believed people meant what they said. Until Claire. She hadn't asked for trust, hadn't reached for power or privilege, had simply stayed, through illness, through silence, through long Vermont winters and Graham's longer moods. And now just a question from an old lawyer had undone all of it. Or maybe not all, just enough to sting. He paused at the edge of the clearing, snow crunching beneath his weight. Above him, the stars had begun to emerge, faint pinpricks against the navy sky. The world felt vast, still. Honest, he exhaled, and in the silence, something loosened. He turned back toward the house, boots leaving careful prints behind him. As he approached the main house, something caught his eye. A sliver of light soft, golden spilled from the guest cottage window. Claire's space. He could just make out her silhouette through the sheer curtain. She was seated in the armchair, book in hand, head tilted slightly as she read. Then she laughed, not loudly, just a small, surprised laugh. The kind people made when a character said something unexpected, when a story found its way to the heart. Graham stood there, unmoving. That sound, unaware, unguarded, pierced something inside him deeper than suspicion ever had, because it was real, entirely separate from him, a life she lived whether or not he ever saw it. And in that moment, he realized something important. If Claire were playing a game, she would never have laughed like that, not when she thought she was alone, not in a way so free it left no room for manipulation. She wasn't hiding anything. She was just living. And he had almost let a ghost from the past convince him to unsee her truth. He turned away from the window, heart heavier but not with doubt, just with the quiet weight of realizing how hard it was to believe good people still existed, even when one of them lived just down the path. Claire, he said, just that. One word, soft, uncertain, almost too quiet to carry across the space between them. But it did, and in that moment, simple, unadorned, unguarded, something shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to draw the breath from the air and place it gently between them, like a bridge built from silence. She turned slowly, not surprised, not startled, just aware, as if she had been waiting, not expecting, but waiting. Graham stood at the threshold of her cottage, his hands in the pockets of his wool coat, shoulders slightly hunched against the cold. The sky behind him was dark, but the kind of dark that made stars bolder. He didn't speak again right away. He let the name linger, like it had waited too long to be spoken aloud. Claire set her book down, marking the page with a ribbon, and stood. The light from her small reading lamp cast soft gold over her sweater, the edges of her face, the room she had made into a life. He looked at her, not as his assistant, not as a fixture in the background of his carefully controlled world, but as a person, a woman, someone who had stayed, not because of obligation, but because she chose to. "I owe you an apology," he said. She didn't move, but something in her expression softened. For what she asked, Graham drew in a long breath, then stepped inside, the warmth of her space folding around him, the scent of cinnamon and books, a blanket draped across the back of the couch, a teacup, still half full. "For doubting you," he said. For listening to old ghosts instead of what I've seen with my own eyes. Claire tilted her head slightly, her hands clasped in front of her. There was no accusation in her stance, only stillness. I understand, she said quietly. Sometimes silence is safer. I've just learned to live inside it. Her words weren't bitter, they weren't sad. They simply were. They walked together after that, out into the crisp night. The snow had hardened just enough to crunch gently beneath their boots, and the moon spread soft light over the pastures like a hush. They didn't speak for several minutes. They didn't need to. But when Graham did speak, his voice held none of the weight it once had in boardrooms or negotiations. It was gentler now, raw and real. I've drawn up something, he said, glancing sideways at her. It's not a test this time. No hidden pages. No fake scenarios. Claire looked at him, waiting. It's a transfer of partial ownership, he said, to the estate, to the horses, to the place you've helped keep breathing. She stopped walking. He stopped, too. I'm not giving it to you because I think you earned it, he said, or because you passed something. I'm giving it to you because I finally understand the difference between control and trust. The air between them held still. Claire didn't reach for his hand. She didn't cry. She didn't ask how much or what it meant. Instead, she looked at him with an expression that held everything: gratitude, strength, sorrow, and something like peace. And then, in a voice quieter than the wind moving through the pine needles, she said, "It's not what you give me, Graham. It's what you've let me keep my dignity." He looked down. That word dignity settled somewhere deeper than he expected. It wasn't a word men like him heard often, certainly not in contracts, not in settlements, but here, now. It felt more valuable than anything in his portfolio. They continued walking, not touching, but not apart. Graham noticed the sound of their footsteps in sync, the way their breaths rose and faded in harmony. It wasn't a grand reconciliation. There was no cinematic music, no dramatic turning point. It was quieter than that, and somehow far more powerful. When they returned to the house, the porch light still glowed softly. Graham paused before opening the door. "Thank you," he said, "for staying, for never asking me to be more than I was ready to be." Claire smiled, faint but sure. "You were always more. You just didn't know how to show it." He opened the door for her, and she stepped through, brushing past him with a grace that came not from elegance, but from being entirely herself. Inside, the fire had been rekindled. The warmth of it reached into the room slowly, like trust itself. Claire turned back to him, hand resting lightly on the banister. "You said my name," she whispered. Graham nodded. "I think I always wanted to," he said. "I just didn't know I was allowed." And with that, she disappeared down the hallway, leaving him alone in the soft glow of the room, but not lonely. For the first time, her name didn't feel like a title. It felt like an invitation, to be seen, to speak, to begin again. And as the fire crackled behind him, Graham whispered her name once more, just to hear how it sounded when it was finally safe to say. By spring, the snow had melted. The paddocks softened under the warming sun. Tiny shoots of green poked bravely through the earth, and the horses stretched longer in the pastures. But in Graham's kitchen on the narrow windowsill above the sink, there sat something that hadn't changed with the seasons, a growing stack of handwritten letters. They were always folded neatly in half, unsealed, ink slightly smudged from the pressure of his fingers. Each week, without fail. Graham wrote one, sometimes two, not to be mailed, not to be filed, just placed carefully on the kitchen windowsill before sunrise, where the light hit around 8 and where Claire would find them when she came in to make her tea. He never handed them to her directly. That wasn't their rhythm. She never said a word about them. But she always read them. He knew, because they were never left behind, never thrown away, and every now and then, she'd glance at the windowsill before walking out, just for a moment, like she expected one to be waiting. And often, Graham didn't know exactly when he started doing it. only that the first letter had poured out of him on a Tuesday evening when the house felt too quiet and his thoughts too loud. He hadn't planned to write more, but something about the act ink on paper, thoughts slowed to match the pace of his handwriting, felt honest. Safer than speaking, truer than silence. The letters weren't grand. They weren't confessions or declarations. They were pieces of him, offered without demand. One talked about the smell of the leather tack room in spring. Another, about a robin who kept returning to the same branch outside his study window. Some were only a paragraph. A thought he hadn't said aloud in years. A memory. A question. He never asked for a reply, and Claire never gave one. Not directly, but each day she came. Tea leaves in one hand, her small notebook in the other. She'd move about the kitchen with quiet purpose, occasionally leaving a note of her own, a quote, a line from a poem. A simple "the hay was wet this morning, check the back stack." Not everything had to be romantic to be intimate. Not everything had to be spoken to be heard. Their rhythm became a kind of ritual, and in that ritual, Graham felt something he hadn't dared hope for presence. Not performative, not conditional, just real. The letters stack slowly held together with twine once the pile reached 10. He stored the earlier ones in a drawer, unsure why, only knowing they mattered. Then, one Thursday, as birds began returning to the trees and the old oak out back whispered its welcome to the breeze, something changed. Claire arrived just after 7, same as always. Her boots tracked a bit of mud near the threshold. She took off her coat, hung it carefully on the same peg, and placed her notebook beside the kettle. Then she paused. On the windowsill, beside the usual folded letter, sat something new. A smaller envelope, cream-colored, with his name, Graham, written in her handwriting. He found it hours later. She had already gone to the stables. The kettle had long since cooled, but the envelope remained deliberate, light as breath, and heavier than anything he'd held in weeks. He didn't open it right away. Instead, he tucked it into his coat pocket and stepped outside, the door creaking softly behind him. The sky was clear, the air full of birdsong and thawing soil. He walked the slow path to the oak tree, the one he had once thought to rebuild into a treehouse. And now, plank by plank, he had begun doing just that, not for nostalgia, not to reclaim boyhood, but to build something again with his hands, something imperfect, something his. He sat on the bottom step, still rough-hewn, and unfolded the letter. It was short. Dear Graham, I don't know if you meant to leave those letters where I'd find them. Maybe you did, but I read every one, and somehow they made the silence feel warmer. I never needed big words from you. I just needed to know that something real was growing here. Thank you for letting things take time. You always said I never asked for anything. Maybe now I will. Please keep writing. Claire. He read it twice. Then again. The wind picked up, lifting a corner of the page before he gently pressed it back down. There was no grand declaration in the letter, no metaphor, no demand, but to him, it felt like someone had just lit a lantern and set it inside his chest. He leaned back against the oak, eyes closed, the letter resting lightly on his knee. Claire had written to him, not because he asked her to, not because she owed him anything, but because something between them had become too full to keep in silence. And now, on this soft spring morning, with birds returning and memories softening, Graham knew trust didn't always arrive in one moment. Sometimes, it unfolded in quiet layers, one letter at a time, and as the light filtered through the branches above, Graham picked up his pen again, not to finish a story, but to begin the next one. It was a small thing, a kitchen window left cracked open on a chilly spring morning. But to Graham, it meant the world. Claire was leaving for a few days, not far, just to Burlington, to care for her younger sister after a minor surgery. She had mentioned it only once, in passing, while folding a dish towel and commenting on how the lilacs would bloom late this year. No dramatic goodbye, no pause for reassurance, just a note on the counter, gone for 3 days. Back Thursday. Don't forget the horse is like the second flake, not the first. And beside it, her mug turned upside down on a saucer, the way she always left it to dry. But it was the window that stayed with him, every night. Claire would close it before locking up, part habit, part old Vermont wisdom. The spring air was still sharp after sunset, and she'd always been particular about keeping the house warm. But that morning, it had been left open, not wide, just cracked, barely an inch. Enough. Graham stood in the kitchen, one hand resting on the counter, the other wrapped around a steaming mug of black tea. He stared at the opening like it held a language he had just begun to understand. She would be back, and for the first time, he didn't feel the need to make her come back. Didn't feel the weight of needing to prove something or hold on too tightly. He just believed it. The difference was quiet, but profound. He walked through the house with a kind of unhurried peace. The fireplace crackled, though the room didn't feel cold. He fed the horses, even remembered to add the second flake, and when he passed the old oak tree, he stopped not out of nostalgia, but out of a new kind of habit, one that honored what could still grow. Later that afternoon, as the light began to lean gold toward the horizon, Graham sat at his writing desk. There was one more letter to write. This one would be different. He didn't fold it and leave it on the windowsill. He didn't tuck it into a drawer or lay it beside the kettle. This one he would carry with him. The bus station was quiet, the kind of quiet that made every footstep feel more deliberate. Claire stood near the far bench, her bag resting at her feet, hands wrapped in her gray knit gloves. She smiled when she saw him. "Didn't expect you to come all the way down here," she said. He handed her the letter, folded in half, edges still warm from his coat pocket. "For the road," he said simply. She looked at it, then looked at him, not questioning, not prying, just receiving. When the bus pulled up, she turned to hug him, not quickly, not with hesitance, just a firm, steady embrace that said more than words could manage. Then she boarded. He waited on the sidewalk, hands in his pockets, until the bus disappeared into the bend of the hill road. Claire didn't wait until she got home to read the letter. She opened it as the bus rolled past the edge of the valley, just as the light began to shift from afternoon to memory. It read, "Dear Claire, I spent a long time believing people stayed only if you made it worth their while, if you paid them, praised them, protected them, but you stayed even when I had nothing left to offer. You stayed when it was quiet, when I was not easy, when trust felt like a risk neither of us could afford. I never needed you to pass a test. Claire, I just needed to believe someone wouldn't leave, and you didn't. So, this isn't really a goodbye letter. It's just me saying, thank you." She closed the letter, pressed it gently between her palms, and leaned her head back against the seat. The bus hummed softly beneath her. She didn't cry, but she did smile. Back at the house, Graham boiled water for tea. He took down 2 mugs, not out of habit, not out of hope, just because some rhythms, once learned in love, don't leave when the person steps out the door. He poured into both. Steam rose from the porcelain, curling into the kitchen air like a kind of prayer unspoken, but heard. He sat down at the small table beside the window, the one she always opened slightly when it was too warm inside, or when she wanted the scent of pine to come through. It was still open. He didn't close it, let the air in, let the light stay, let there be space for return. Outside, the oak tree stood tall and quiet, and beside it, the frame of the rebuilt treehouse had begun to take shape, sturdy, imperfect, real. Graham sipped from his mug, then glanced across the table at the second cup. Still full, still warm, not waiting, just ready. And by the window. The curtain lifted slightly in the breeze, a reminder that something had passed through and might come back again. Sometimes, the people who seem the quietest are the ones who carry the deepest truths, and sometimes, the bravest thing we can do is stay. This story reminds us that trust is not built in grand moments, but in small, ordinary acts like listening without judgment, showing up without being asked, and honoring someone's silence without needing to fill it. We all carry scars. We've all been hurt, betrayed, or left behind. But healing doesn't always arrive with fireworks. Sometimes, it shows up in a letter left on a windowsill or a cup of tea poured for two, even when only one person is home. As we grow older, we may learn that what we seek is not perfection, but presence, not promises, but consistency. And when we find someone who stays not to fix us, but simply to see us, we begin to understand loyalty is not proven by tests. It is shown by time. So, leave the window open. Someone may still be on their way back. Thank you for spending your time with this story. If it touched your heart, even in a small way, we hope you'll help us share it with others who may need a quiet reminder that kindness, trust, and healing are still possible. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us keep telling stories that matter. Until next time, stay gentle with yourself and leave a little window open for hope.